All right, why don't we get started? Is it working? Yes, it is working. Okay.
Directional.
Yeah, I see. So this is the last panel, and then we will have, well, no, not last panel. We'll have one more break, and then Steve will have sort of concluding comments in the last hour, and then we'll go to dinner. It's a very nice dinner. Hope you guys can all make it. So these papers are all, I guess, to varying degrees. The last three papers are varying degrees of critique. So I'm going to try not to say a word. I'm just going to sit here, just keep my mouth shut and listen and take notes and do the best I can in that way. And we'll start with Jarris Grove. I have no idea what you're going to argue, but it should definitely be interesting. So we'll start here.
Great, thanks. Actually wrote a different talk yesterday based on the conversation with Catherine. So,
Thanks.
no, so that it seemed a little less contentious and tried to figure out where the problem is for me. And I think I'm picking up actually exactly where Mark leaves off, which is how to position Q amongst other kinds and claims to knowledge, and what that means for kind of critical practice. And I'm sort of broadly thinking about three very different ways of doing IR. There's breaking things, which is what I see post-structuralism trying to do, just like throw all the dishes off the table. There's fixing things, which is kind of how I see Alex trying to do. We have all these long historical philosophical problems, and I got the answer. And then there's building things, which are by definition not an answer, but I think a kind of constructive project, which is how I think of speculative theory or speculative thinking, right? You have to build a thing, and then you try to see what it does. I don't think so in exactly the same way. And a lot of it will revolve around how I feel about the CCP, differently than I think Alex says. But it's not so much a critique as a kind of rejoinder. The last thing I want to say before I get into the meat of it, I really want to echo what I think has been in all the talks, which is this is an incredible book. In fact, it should not exist, right? By the demand. No, I'm quite serious about that, that there's nothing about the modern academy that should make this book happen. In fact, there's a million different ways that trying to write this book gets punished now. And so I think that does make this a kind of once-in-a-generation book, the way I think On Diplomacy was, the way I think Bounding Power were, where you just like take on the whole world, and you're like, I'm actually going to make an argument about the whole world, and you're going to get lambasted for at least 10 or 20 years before anybody bothers actually reading it from start to finish. So that, I think, in and of itself, should be commended, because I think that's where real thinking takes place, and this is the first book in my generation of IR where that's happened. That generation being, I started in 2005. Okay, so I want to try to horizontalize in a different way than I think Alex is trying to. I want to horizontalize where knowledge sits with quantum rather than just horizontalizing or flattening ontology. And I want to see what I think that may do to where we think quantum fits as a resource for international relations. So I'm going to take these two quotes, which I take quite seriously, but in tension with one another. Thoreau, his first entry from his diaries, all matter indeed is capable of entertaining thought. It was actually one of the first sort of panpsychist moments that I had, and I think it's actually the one that most influences Walt Whitman, and this sort of tradition of panpsychism that develops out of American political thought. The second is by Hans Blumenberg, right, like that, like German mean. Stories are told in order to kill something, right? Which is to say that every story we tell excludes something else, right? We tell a story, we construct a narrative about how the knowledge is supposed to work precisely because we want to fix something. And Blumenberg actually makes the point that almost always the thing we want to kill is time or uncertainty. Right? That's primarily the reason we tell stories. So I want to think about what the quantum story is, in a certain sense, what it kills, and then also still hold on to this quantum insight, which Alex develops of panpsychism. And in part, that's because I want to not try to make recourse to quantum theory, as in quantum theory of physics, but as a quantum crisis which develops around the turn of the 20th century, which I think is much broader than physics. And if we take that and we horizontalize this crisis in meaning about how the world works is taking place in multiple disciplines, both inside and outside the sciences, then I think we run fewer risks about the kind of science envy arguments that we often have, as well as the kinds of science exceptionalism arguments we often try to make in trying to ground things in something like the CCP. So I'm going to quickly go through what I think these crises are, and I'll refer where they fall in quantum physics, and then I'm going to try to show where they fall in other disciplines. So the first one is discreteness, right? So we have a crisis over discreteness. And you see this in the observer problem, an entanglement or the communication between particles despite spatial distance. In non-locality, electrons as possibilities rather than objects of particular coordinates. We have it in a problem of scale, which comes through in the quantum crisis. So this is Heisenberg's curiosity about genetics, which I think is actually fascinating and we don't talk about enough, which is one of the examples he gives of how quantum phenomena cross scales is that radiation causes changes to evolutionary history, right? So a particular gene gets knocked out sometimes, but not others. And it changes the whole course, not just of an individual animal, but of the entire species. Space-time, so the basic makeup of perceived reality doesn't conform with empirical testing. 4, causality and contingency, so we have Bohr's concept of complementarity. And I want to say that while quantum physics can be useful as a set of provocations for these problems, they in no way have a monopoly over complementarity, entanglement, or even the wave-particle duality. In fact, quantum physics is only a sliver of the quantum crisis, for which I think philosophy and social theory were undergoing similar crises as Einstein, Bohr, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, and actually in many cases a full generation before. So at least in the case of Tard, who I'll talk about, and certainly then contemporaneously with debates between Whitehead and Einstein, Bergson and Einstein, right? A dialogue in which it can take place. And so I think social theory has already created significant contributions, which we could have just as easily called quantum. And so I want to be careful that we locate the quantum crisis within physics alone. So here are some of those family resemblances, or maybe chains of equivalence, right? So there are actual dialogues between Whitehead, Bergson, and Einstein. In other cases, I think they're just sort of parallel crises, as in the case of Thoreau and Whitman. The first is Spinoza's parallelism, which certainly makes a big comeback in the late 19th century. And in the 20th century, we can see it also in cyberneticists and biologists like Henri Atlan, who's still a working artificial intelligence designer. But this idea that within matter is contained both mentality and materiality. They don't cross or intersect, but they are attributes of a monism, right? One world, right? 2, we have Bergson's intensive versus extensive things, and I actually think this is also very important because it's what allows him to think about matter and memory working in parallel, but not having to be reducible to one another, right? So we don't have to have the CCP for memory, but it doesn't mean that we have to have extra material things. It's just that intensive distinctions don't exist in space and time. 3, Tard's monadology. Everything is a society from top to bottom, and that's going to actually be, I think, my most important claim, which is that what would happen if, instead of quantum being a way to try to build the weird from the bottom all the way to the top, we do the Tard thing of building society all the way from the macro to the quantum, which is something that Alex deals with quite significantly, but I think the emphasis different is important. The last one is probably my favorite, which is Whitehead's dipolarity, which is rather than seeing matter and mentality as in parallel, think about how a magnet has both a north and south pole, but is both the same substance and the same object. Right? So he tries to develop the relationship between matter and mentality on a dipolarity, not a bipolarity. And the last one, Deleuze's virtual actual, where we have actually a fairly simple virtual realm, right, as opposed to the Platonic one, which is really complex. And then when things get complex is when they move from the virtual into the actual, right? The actualization, the concretization, is when things get crazy, weird, complex, diverse. So here's Bergson's sort of explanation of that, which I find quite helpful. He says, we necessarily express ourselves by means of words, and we usually think in terms of space. That is to say, language requires us to establish between our ideas the same sharp and precise distinctions, the same discontinuity as between material objects. This assimilation of thought of things is useful in practical life and necessary in most of the sciences. But it may be asked whether the insurmountable difficulties presented by certain philosophical problems do not arise from our placing side by side in space phenomena which do not occupy space, and whether by merely getting rid of the clumsy symbols around which we are fighting, see yesterday's conversation, I was the clumsy one, we might not bring the fight to an end. When an illegitimate translation of the unextended into the extended, or the quality into quantity, has introduced contradictions at the very heart of the question, contradiction must, of course, recur in the answer. So for Tard, the way that we do that is everything is a society, which means we don't have the agent structure problem. Humans in particular are imitative and entangled species, right? Meaning that from top to bottom, like everything else, They're going to be inter-involved. And that change happens because of innovating and syncing swarms at multiple scales from crowds, nations, and even planetary assemblages. I think the important thing about this is that if we start at that top, we don't risk the kind of methodological individualism, which I think could come when we go from quantum to bottom. Or we look for the will in the individual rather than looking for will at larger scales. So no agent structure problem for Tard. Tard says, in the mysterious basement of the phenomenal world may be quite rich in differences, though differences of another sort. Importantly, the process of change itself may be undergoing a change. Whitehead, in his version. So for him, there's no discreteness between objects, meaning there's no quanta, right? But wholes are all the way up and all the way down. The world is a process in becoming, so novelty exceeds the mechanics of contingency. And for Whitehead, that means, and I think this is really important, a way of life is something more than the shifting relations of bits and matter in space and time. Life depends upon such external fact. The all-important aesthetics arise out of them and is deflected by them. But in abstraction from the atmosphere of feeling, one behavior pattern is as good as another. They're all equally uninteresting. Which is another way of saying that the quantum may be the source of the organization of life, but everything that we call interesting about life is actually in an aesthetic domain of intensity, not one in extension. And here's my best example of that, because I want to try to get over this distinction we've been drawing the whole time between metaphor and reality. World's largest metaphor hits iceberg, 1,500 dead in symbolic tragedy. Right? The Titanic was a metaphor for modernity, and it really killed people, which is a way for, if we take Whitehead seriously, of putting things back together, that metaphors are actually real. Right? They aren't somehow subsidiary of quantum. Right? They are neither of a different order of language, right? Where, well, language is imprecise, right? And therefore it must not be real. But precisely can form, build ships, and crash them into icebergs. And I would say it didn't become any less metaphorical when the collapse happened and the reel of the iceberg penetrated the ship. Bohr agrees. When it comes to atoms, language can be used only in poetry. The poet, too, is not nearly so concerned with describing facts as with creating images. I don't think that is his discounting of language. I think that is actually him investing in language the very power to make worlds. That's what I would call building as opposed to breaking. So what the world is, in a quantum sense of the CCP, is not what the world means. And what the world means is just as real as the quanta. Maxwell put this together quite well. A full generation before. James Clerk Maxwell said, the only laws of matter are those which our mind must fabricate, and the only laws of mind are fabricated by matter. That's not a dialectic, that's a torsion. And a torsion is a permanent fact of the relationship between meaning-making and quantum emergence. I think Heisenberg has a similar kind of claim. He says, the hope of understanding all aspects of intellectual life on the principles of physics is no more justified than the hope of the traveler who believes he will have obtained the answer to all problems once he has journeyed to the end of the world. So we can journey to the end of the world of material, right, meaning the sort of quantum characteristics of it, but that, according to Heidegger, that ontic sort of closure of the CCP doesn't get us any closer to any of the problems of meaning-making which are emergent from it. Instead, I think we could have a kind of extreme realism, where we punt on the question of whether or not quantum makes an ultimate difference, and instead we do what Valerie said about World War II. We allow these encounters, these problems, these crises to just screw us up, right? And figure out how to put the world back together. So he says, a blow which strikes us from an unexpected direction gives us a sudden and novel sensation of the existence of our own body as something unknown to us. We are not aware of our own extent. Such a brutal sensation can make us conscious by a secondary effect of the unexpected in shape of our living domain. For me, this changes the way in which we have theorized. It's not that we work out all the quantum problems and work out the relationship to the social order. It's that we allow things like the quantum crisis in physics, or the crisis of scale in Whitehead, or the crisis of extension and intention in Bergson, slap us upside the head when we encounter things like tsunamis we couldn't predict, world-changing events that we couldn't make sense of, and then we work our way back out, right, through a series of problems, which is what I see and think that Bohr and Heisenberg were up to anyway. I don't believe that they started with a mountain of data and they figured out how to do it. I think they read the whole canon of philosophy like all the other Germans of the time, and then that intuition made them seek out certain kinds of data. And the reason I know that is because that's exactly what they said to Whitehead and Bergson. And I know that the reason why Whitehead and Bergson could talk to them is because, unlike us, Whitehead and Bergson could do the math too, right? And so there's something there too, which is like, we've lost that kind of moment where we each speak each other's language. So what are the kind of Wintian imperatives, which I think this resists a bit? That's the CCP. Right? This is when. It's very, so this is a quote from him yesterday. He says, if we are quantum, then we must have a quantum social science. I don't think that's true. I think if the world's quantum, then we must ask what the hell a social science would be that could engage in that problem. Right? So rather than seeing quantum as a solution, I'd rather keep it as a permanent provocation. He says, but you have no choice, a little later. And I think actually we precisely do have a choice. Right? So if we take Bergson and Whitehead seriously, that problem of mentality is, of course, dependent upon the quantum, but not reducible to the quantum, then the choice in meaning making, particularly in the way that we build a social science, is highly dependent on what we want the social science to do. Do we want it to explain? Do we want it to predict? Or do we want to make worlds? And I think there's no magical trapdoor from the ontic to the ontological. It's fine if you want to predict with quantum science. We can fight about that later. But if you want to do world making, then I think quantum is at best a provocation. It's not an answer. So what does that mean? What is social science for? I think this is where I may differ the most, and then I'll be done. Which is, I think that I'm on the side of world making. I don't think that social science has to be about predicting or about having purchase on how the material world will play out. I think it's about how we intervene in the material world and we make it. Right? How do we understand the metaphor of the Titanic as it's killing 1,500 people, which is metaphorical and material at the same time? The second is that I think it means giving up on the distinction between descriptive versus normative. Right? Because every time we participate in these problems and these provocations, we are making a new world which will necessarily have normative consequences for what can and can't be thought and what can and can't be done. Which means we give up on the predictive, right? Does not mean we give up on the empirical, because every one of those descriptions and engagements with the problem will be involved in the world making of matter making at exactly the same time. So I come back. That still means that all matter, right, is material, all thought is material. But we should be attentive to the way in which a certain part of signification and the emergence of this non-physical portion of the CCP could get killed precisely by the attempt to see quantum as an answer rather than merely as a starting point. And I'll just say that I think that has really profound understandings for why we start at the quantum level rather than starting at the social and work our way up rather than down. I don't think it means that we lead to death, meaning that we have to be dead things. I still think it allows for will, but it allows for collective wills, partial wills, temporary wills, emergent wills, and wills we can shape. I disagree that I don't think Foucault gives up on consciousness. He calls it ascesis, and in volume 3 and in volume 4 of the History of Sexuality, he talks about ascesis as both something that can be done collectively, right, with a master, or something where you can work on yourself, right? Now, working on self is, at its moment, exactly material and psychic. And the last is that I think it means that history matters in a different way. I think that there's a temptation in Alex's book to almost turn quantum into an essence, where it's a good precisely in and of itself. And I want to say that history or form matters more, right? The way we organize that quanta is not reducible to quantum physics. And I think that's actually where the debate between Bergson and Einstein happened, right? That things like duration, the experience of time, radically change the possibility of politics and ethics, but they are not constrained by the CCP. John Philip Santos is where I'll end. He says, the mind and heart leave no fossils. All of their artifacts are made of the most fleeting and unstable stuff. Whatever that stuff is, I don't think it's physical, but I also don't think it's spiritual. And that dipolarity which Whitehead describes, I think should be a moment of indecision and problematization rather than under a kind of regulative ideal of what the physical could be. Now that might still leave us in this kind of fight between science and philosophy, right, where we're sort of unintelligible to one another. But I don't think that actually has to be the case. If we see scientific experiments as questions rather than answers, And we see philosophical speculation not as deconstruction or as solution building, but also as experiments to problems, then I think that we can learn to speak languages with one another in a way that might open up the possibility of having those great debates again. Not the great debates of IR, but ones in which physicists and philosophers would actually seek each other out, rather than Stephen Hawking say that philosophy is dead. Thanks.
We're on a little bit of a tight schedule just because we have our last session and we get dinner, so I'm going to be a little bit more rigid, but I'll shut up. So.
Just, I can be very responsive. I agree with a lot of it. There's one thing that, well, two things that worry me.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put too sharp a line between philosophy and science. I know you don't want to.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the forefront of contemporary science comes into philosophy. Think about string theory, for example. So they've been as speculative as our philosophers at some level. The other is world making. Yeah. I mean, I kind of agree with you, but we aren't the only ones world making. Basically, everybody's world making.
But the,
So
yeah.
does social science have a special way of world making that is different from other people? If not, what do we call
We should make one. But if we're right about TARD, we should be making one with a lot of non-human, non-singular, non-individual things, right? So if we don't start with individual, right, sort of methodological presumptions, right, in which the subject is the actor, or the individual is the actor, or even the state is the actor, then we'd have to start actually looking around and seeing what kinds of societies can generate matters of concern. And to me, that would need to build a whole new social science. Now, I think that social science, which actually looked around the world and said, what are these kinds of blurry but congealing collectives, which we then need to leverage in particularly in interesting ways, would lead to a whole new set of strategies too, right? We'd be looking for evidence we could feel, evidence that we believed, right? All these kinds of things which facts don't always do. So that's the first part. The second part is, I think you're mushing science together a bit. I think there's a huge difference between string theory. I know you don't, but I'm saying that the question, I think string theory and that kind of like pure theoretical physics, that's just what was called natural philosophy before the divorce. And for me, that's fine. But what I think we shouldn't do, which I think some scientists do, I won't mention any by name who have a PBS special about the cosmos, but the presumption that empirical investigation or the generation of data closes those theoretical questions rather than provoking them, for me is an error of methodology, right? So I would like to horizontalize that sort of relationship between evidence finding as problematization and evidence finding as solution. And I think part of that's just because the scientists have so much pressure on themselves now to apply it all the time, right? So everybody says, oh, okay, well, if that quantum theory is true, what can you do with it? And then they're like, oh, great, well, we'll make a computer out of it. Yeah.
I only know 2% of what you're talking about, but I want to see whether my intuition is right. Should the title for the paper be Roots, not Roots? R-O-U-T-E-S?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not R-O-O-T-S? Am I getting the central point?
Yes. Where we start and how we navigate actually makes much more of a difference than origins. But that difference makes a difference, right? And I think an important one. Yeah.
World making is the goal of social science.
My social science, not all social science. Yeah.
Because I was wondering, like, then how would we adjudicate good work from bad work? Because it's more like what you like.
I would say that's actually how we already adjudicate what's good work. And the proof of that is like how much really predictive social science has made any really important predictions lately. And I'll throw out there that my favorite example is like I work in war studies. All of the war studies models that thought they'd finally gotten a handle on like bombing data in relationship to coercion developed the model for the second Gulf War, right? Because they thought that they had actually figured out some relationship between the application of force and the likelihood or probability that a population would consent to being occupied. I would say that most Machiavellians who had gotten to the Machiavelli chapter on a society that's known self-determination versus a society that's been subjugated could have figured out that problem in the right direction with a lot less data. So I'll actually make predictive, I actually think that there are intuitive characteristics of world-making theory which are more predictive than repeatable forms of predictive theory. And I think that should puzzle us. It should puzzle us that the quantitative predictive models are not, I mean, they're as bad as the economics models, right, that don't take money into account. So, oh, sorry.
So you're, I kind of can sense vital materialism in a lot of what you're talking about, which does remind me quite a bit of the panpsychism in Alice's book.
Yeah.
But you're talking about world making that is not predictive, and my question is, do you see that world making as this kind of all-encompassing vital materialist world making, and it's not predictive, but isn't it kind of futurist anyway? And then how do you relate that versus the idea of duration?
Yeah.
Or is it kind of future-oriented?
So 3 quick things. The first is that I don't think you need the vital in vital materialism, right? If you're Thoreauvian, right, matter was all, like, there's no special stuff of life. There's no intellecty, right? Like, this is the Aristotle mistake. The second is that world making isn't the same thing as predicting. Predicting presumes that T1 and T2 are separated by the measurement, right? Meaning you can predict something based upon your understanding of initial conditions. And if there's anything we could take from quantum physics, but certainly from complexity theory and definitely from history, it's that when you make the cut to measure T1, the future scatters into a bunch of possibilities. And how you pursue what prediction you made changes what kinds of other possibilities become possible, which means that I think you have an inner involvement rather than a prediction. So world forming is an inter-involved process of world making, which doesn't always turn out how you intend for it to, but changes based on your participation. The only way that futuring would ever work as a predictive model is if the world would actually stand still. So like you could like take the cut and measure it from space and then let it work out, right? So like for me, the idea that you would like not do a thing or do a thing based on the prediction you were making seems totally crazy. As compared to like doing a thing precisely because you want to be part of a particular kind of world and you do everything you can to try to produce it. So like as a quick example, for me, climate change is not a worthy political struggle because the models have gotten so much better. It's a worthy political struggle because of the assholes on the other side, right? Like I can do a political economy or ecology of like what kind of world they want, independent of knowing exactly how much sea level rise is going to take place. And the nice thing about that is if it's about the world making, like how do we have a less cruel organization of the political order, then I'm also not going to be tempted by really quick fix solutions to try to get out of the prediction, like geoengineering, right, which would way jack up the sovereign orders of great powers and would merely somehow act upon a predicted model of what the temperature rise is going to be. I try to make a world with a bunch of people where we could, hope for that, right, and we could produce the chains of equivalence to fight for that, but not give over to the, well, we know there's going to be a 2.5 centigrade model, so we better seed the oceans and build life on Mars, which seems to me misguided. So,
One more question.
Scott. Yeah.
Thanks, Jared. I actually really enjoyed that. This is more just tossing this out there. What concerned me wasn't necessarily the world, it was the making.
Yeah.
So immediately it was like homo faber and the classic ideal of when we make something, we know what it's made of, what purpose it's for, and probably it's human, it's going to end sometime. So how exactly, and this is 2 quick questions, but they're related, how is it made without the kind of representationalist Western metaphysics that underpins the whole classical problem we're kind of trying to avoid, which I know is a loaded question.
No, but it's an easy Tardian question, which is there's no man, there's no human, because we're top to bottom societies.
And how do we know, let's say, what world emerges? Right? So
We don't know. We can't guarantee what world emerges. We can just participate in it. And I understand that that's scary for a lot of people because there's like a ton of humility there. Like at best, all you can do is participate. But that is all the best we can do, right? Foucault in his debate with Lacan's great student Jacques-Alain Miller. Alain Miller was like, "Oh, don't you still assume the subject? Isn't that an unconscious?" He said, "No, there's just selves." He's like, "Oh, you mean lots of selves?" No, he's like, in selves there are selves. And below those selves, there are more selves. And right, we actually have empirical reasons to believe that, right? Like we have a bunch of things that we got by phagocytosis, like mitochondria, which run our systems. But then we have a bunch of things we haven't phagocytosed, like E. coli in our gut, and a bunch of things that affect our moods because they affect our ability to be happy, stressed, et cetera, right? At what scale is the world making happening? I don't think I master those things. I think I agree with Alex on will, but that will is highly distributed depending on where you make the cut of measurement, right? So I'm just as happy to do the world making with my gut flora, which I guess is a little vital materialist-y. But I also think that I make the world with a bunch of other people and like some animals that I'm particularly fond of, and you know, a place that I'm particularly fond of, and some political coalitions I'm particularly fond of. And you're absolutely right, it's what I like. But I dare you to create a criterion which is not ultimately an aesthetic judgment. Even if it's only the shared, yeah, I'm sure. But in the sense that Whitehead means it, which is that there is no place from which you aren't making a judgment for what appears to make sense, right? You have to make sense out of sense. Right? It doesn't just like, it's not like one of those like stereograms where like if you stare at it long enough, you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Right? You make sense, and you make it in a participatory, right, and collective way. And I think that means that, I mean, I wish it were not the case, maybe. I don't really, but I know others do, but we don't have that. We don't have a ground to stand on where we could do that.
All right, I'm going to push us forward.
Yep.
Thank you, Jeff. So now you have David Waldner, and actually David's paper was published last summer as part of a forum on my book, and is skeptical from front to back, so I've read the paper carefully, and I'm working on a response.
You said you wouldn't speak.
Yeah, I'm not going to speak. I haven't said a word yet, so I'm just introducing you.
So as Alex says, the paper was published, and when he asked me to come to the workshop, I said, I've done nothing other than that paper. You can have that paper again. And it turns out, to give you a sense of how often I recycle old work, I wrote this paper, oh God, 15 years ago.
I read that version.
Yes. I wrote this paper under very different circumstances for different reasons. After reading it, I think Alex's antenna went up, and he said, someone else is writing about quantum mechanics. I will find this person. And he sent me an email out of the blue saying I heard about this. So then the paper gathered dust for 15 years, and when I got the request to submit something to the symposium, I said, I can publish this. I was very excited. The bottom line is I have a very different perspective on quantum mechanics from what I gather is pretty much everybody in the room. I have different reasons for engaging in quantum theory than I think most of you have. I've learned very different lessons from quantum theory than I think most of you have. I'm, I think, much more skeptical than most of you. And so I'm going to talk about that different perspective and what I've learned from it and what might be of some interest to you. And then I want to conclude with some thoughts that have been filtering through my head as I sat here over the past 24 hours or so, thinking about the criteria of comparative model selection, why we should decide to go quantum. And I'll work through that a little bit. So let's see how this works. So the different path. The first thing to say is my field is comparative politics, not international relations. I've really read no IR theory at all. Comparative politics is just a very different animal. And one of the ways that matters, I think, is there's less emphasis in my subfield, or at least with my networks within that subfield, which I think are representative, to develop what I'm calling here a universal social theory. Matthias used the metaphor earlier with me of scaling the mountain. You want to get to the highest possible point to get the largest perspective. I would never say that. I can go weeks, months, years, perhaps a decade without saying either epistemology or ontology. Clock starts over again. What people in my field tend to want to do is place emphasis on explaining particulars. And I resist the urge to invoke the term locality here. Just particulars, spatio-temporal particulars. The reason I got involved in quantum theory, let me be very clear about this. I'm going to be skeptical about quantum theory, but in order to do that, I've got to talk about quantum theory that made me skeptical about its application. I feel foolish doing this. I feel foolish saying anything about quantum theory. Most of what I'm going to say to you, I cut and paste out of articles I read, okay? So just to be clear, I don't know what I'm talking about at some level, and yet I think the perspective I bring is an important one that I just haven't heard enough of today. What was driving me crazy was the problem of making structural arguments that would have this implication of being deterministic. For example, I would want to make a claim about a causal effect of economic structures on prospects for democracy. And that excites a lot of debate in my field because it seems to suggest that people are just automatons, that nothing can be done. If a place is mired in dictatorship, it's just going to stay in dictatorship. And this becomes partially an analytic issue, but partially a normative issue. Adam Jaworski, who's a prominent figure in my field, basically said, how dare you make structural arguments, and this is normatively untenable. And so I made all these structural arguments, and I said, well, I should probably figure out whether these are actually theoretically and analytically tenable before I worry about the normative. Here's what kept me awake at night. If I'm going to make an argument about economic structures and democracy, then I'm going to make a claim that I can derive preferences over political institutions from some particular historical class position. And I've emphasized or italicized particular and historical because I don't think I'm essentializing. I don't think I'm naturalizing. If you disagree with me, I'd be interested in that. I study history. I study it from an anthropological perspective, but I make claims about political economy along the way. But what you observe is heterogeneous preferences over political institutions, which we can most easily say a lot of rich kids become Marxists, right? Engels was the son of a textile manufacturer. Che Guevara left a comfortable upper middle class Argentinian lifestyle to go, foment revolution in the Andes, etc. So on the one hand, we have heterogeneous preferences when our theory says there shouldn't be heterogeneous preferences, the theory that we want to confirm. On the other hand, at the macro level, we simply do not observe stable democracies among, for example, agro-exporting economies based on labor repression. And so my problematic was always to reconcile the macrostructural determinism of the second claim about not seeing stable democracies given labor repressive agriculture with a micro-level claim about heterogeneity. Which would mean, I came to think of it in quantum terms in this way, how do we reconcile micro-level indeterminism and irreducible indeterminism with macro-level determinism and stability? And that's what I set out doing. Now, that's the issue I think has been elided a little bit too much today, which is the idea that there's a border between the quantum domain and the classical domain. This is, I like this particular picture of it. The sign here is signed by Neil Bohr, of course, and what we get is the border is determined by the number of atoms in the system that we're studying. We know that's not right. We know that the quantum domain can move over into phenomena that have large numbers of atoms, and that we would think of as being macrostructural. And yet I still want to hold that something about this is correct, and my efforts to figure out what might make this correct, or to put differently, to understand what determines the transition between the quantum and the classical domain is what led, I think, to some new insights. And I want to stress the classical domain is not just Newton's equations. It's Newton equations with the second law of thermodynamics. And in particular, I'd want to say it's Newton's equations with second law of thermodynamics as given a statistical interpretation by Ludwig Boltzmann. And Boltzmann is really the hero of my talk today. He's one of my heroes. And as you all know, of course, before his work could be validated, he took his own life. So it's a tragic hero to be following behind. But I'm not in danger of following that closely in his footsteps, hopefully. So let's talk a little bit about coherence. I want to talk about it because A, it hasn't been talked about enough in my opinion, and B, I think Badruddin said something very important. Let's define our terms. I'm going to define them in ordinary language. Again, cut and paste from articles, but ordinary language nonetheless, as physicists try to explain what they're getting at with their equations. Quantum phenomena require that the wave sources be coherent. And I'm going to look at the physicists and see if I'm making any major mistakes along the way, which I understand to mean they have a constant phase difference, they have the same frequency and the same wave form, which means coherence means something other than makes sense. We can't use the term coherence in our ordinary way and then draw on some ideas that come out of quantum mechanics. That I find deeply troubling, and I'll talk about why at the end. The point is this: it's coherence that produces interference. And it's that interference stemming from coherence that makes quantum probability theory necessary. All right, so if we did the if we looked at the two-slit experiment and we studied it with classical probability, what would we do? We would multiply the unconditional probability of passing through a screen times the conditional probability of being seen on the screen, conditional on having passed through the screen. We'd sum over the slits, we'd get an answer, and we'd get the wrong answer. Quantum probability theory says you've got to take into account that our wave sources are coherent. This is creating interference, and therefore, when you do the probability calculations, you have to have an interference term. That is what I understand to be the basis of quantum probability theory. Well, there's something called quantum decoherence, which I understand to be the phenomenon by which interactions between a system and its environment spontaneously suppress interference. Decoherence can be induced by measurement, the correlative of the collapse of the wave function, when every probability reduces to zero except the probability for where the particle actually can be located. The idea is that when coherent waves are disrupted, the interference terms drop out of the wave function. We're left with a classical probability function in which Schrodinger's wave function no longer describes the system's evolution. And I understand this transition to take place related to the size of the number of atoms, because as the number of atoms goes up, we are increasingly in a situation in which the system is going to interact with its environment, and any interaction with the environment, including the role of a stray photon or the random arrival of a cosmic ray, intervenes and hence disrupts the coherence of waves, which is a way in which systems open systems in interaction with their environment are measuring themselves. And once they measure themselves, they become, in effect, classical. For those who want to follow up on this, these are the pieces I read that helped me understand this. I particularly recommend Guido Bacigalupi's piece in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It was very, very important to me. Let me draw some more implications from this. First, it's definitely possible to maintain coherence in the macro world. You need to understand that I accept that point. I'm not simply saying once you get large enough, you're in a classical domain. Bohr's initial division, as I understand, is not strictly true, but the macrostructural phenomena that exhibit coherence require carefully controlled settings that we can't readily identify in most of the macro world. Instead, in virtually all macro systems, the component particles move randomly. And that random movement is the definition of, as I understand it, I got to stop saying that. Everything is as I understand it. Definition of non-coherence. I've tried to understand this in terms of Boltzmann's statistical interpretation of the second law of thermodynamics, which says something like this. It is statistically possible for even in huge macro systems for all the particles to move coherently, but the odds are very, very much against it. And to say the odds are very much against it really underestimates just how much the odds are against it. Coherent movement and hence superposition, and hence things like entanglement, are not, as I understand it, features of the macro world we experience, because the odds of such coherent movement by trillions and trillions of particles in random motion are vanishingly small. Superposition in the macro world is physically possible, but statistically unlikely, in the same sense the spontaneous freezing of a beaker of water is both possible and highly unlikely. If, like you take your bourbon with one ice cube in it, don't unplug your freezer and wait for the laws of thermodynamics to create ice cubes for you. You will go a long time without the bourbon that you will need very, very much. I want to be clear what decoherence accomplishes for us. It is not a solution to the measurement problem. Quantum mechanics with decoherence cannot give a complete theoretical account of the appearance of macroscopic stability in the everyday world, which is what a complete solution to the measurement problem would look like. Indeed, decoherence creates this problem of everything's measuring everything, and it creates this inflation of measurement, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around. I'm not claiming I've solved anything. I'm not claiming I've solved, geez, I can't I'm not claiming the people I read who gave me these ideas solved anything. I'm saying as social scientists, we don't need the complete solution to all quantum mechanical problems. All we need to know is that ordinary macroscopic objects, with very limited and unusual exceptions, are subject to continuous dynamic interactions with their environment, and these objects therefore correspond to the classical domain characterized by Newton's laws of mechanics and the second law of thermodynamics. In effect, decoherence decisively loads the dice towards transitions between stable quantum states, evincing macroeconomic stability, and thereby ensuring that quantum and classical predictions of the behavior of macroscopic systems are consistent with one another. I then tried to take this one step further and think about how we could take the inspiration of decoherence and the statistical interpretation of it and use it to explain my original problem, which is how to understand why I believe at the agent level there's heterogeneity of beliefs, preferences, goals, etc., but I still feel comfortable in some circumstances making structural claims that sound very deterministic. And what I propose is that first we describe interactions of members of a social system as microstates in an n-dimensional space with micro-level indeterminism, where the n dimensions are defined by whatever you think is important to describe that system. We simply allow that agents are moving around in any of the dimensions as you define them, and they're moving around in ways we can't possibly predict, that there's no knowledge of initial conditions that would tell you where people go next, what they think next, what they believe next, what worlds they make next. I have no problem thinking about it in those terms. Second, the system has potential emergent properties or macrostates with properties that are not fully reducible to any of the microstates, that we have two alternative descriptions that are not in conflict with one another, one at the level of microstates or the micro units, and one at the level of macro level properties. Third, determinism then depends upon the degree of correspondence between dynamic transitions between microstates and macrostates. If there were an infinite number of microstates and an infinite number of macrostates, then all of the indeterminism of the micro level would immediately become evident at the macro level. But if we understand that there are a drastically smaller number of macrostates, like just a few, for example, then you could have, in principle, a great deal of unit level or micro level indeterminism and still have macro level determinism in this sense. Insofar as time-dependent transitions are confined to a region of phase space corresponding to a single macrostate with defined properties, then we would have micro-level indeterminism and macro-level determinism. Well, why should that happen? If we have irreducible indeterminism at the micro level, why should it ever be confined to a particular region of our n-dimensional phase space, however we've defined that? And I took the idea now from equilibrium statistical mechanics, which says external parameters confine allowable transitions corresponding to a single macrostate. The macrostate is then selected by the probabilistic transition between microstates within the designated region of a phase space. Where does that get us in the end? I want to talk about a little bit about, this is my last slide, comparative model evaluation and selection. I've heard a lot of people say a lot of different things over the past 36 hours, all of which, for the record, are fascinating. I mean, it's just, my mind is quite blown by all of this. A lot of different justifications for why one would make the quantum move. And actually, I think I've been very inarticulate in posing questions, because all of my questions have been, on what criterion are you justifying the move to the quantum? So here's the various things that I've heard. First, existing models are classical. We know classical is wrong, and it's been superseded by QM. Therefore, we have to go QM. I've suggested some reasons to believe that's not necessarily true. And I don't think the reasons I've given are a priori reasons. I think it's a subject of empirical investigation. Second, newer models have aesthetically valuable features. We just heard a talk that said that's how we should do model selection. I'm not going to start that conversation now, but here I'm really orthodox and I don't know, bourgeois. I mean, I have trouble with that one, but it would be a great conversation to have. Third, another one I've heard a lot, perceived correspondence between quantum theory and a particular research domain. This one scares me. I've heard about correspondences, I've heard about mirroring, I've heard all sorts of ideas. This sounds like that. We have to worry about the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Right? We really have to worry about the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So if you're making those sorts of correspondence arguments, I urge you to tell me why you're not committing a logical fallacy. Fourth, social phenomena are genuinely quantum brains. Boy, that's I think that's the critical chapter of the book. That's the chapter of the book that I started reading with some trepidation. Because I think I'm open-minded enough that I genuinely believe what I'm about to say. If Alex had convinced me in that chapter that quantum brains exist, I would have been on the quantum train. If the social world is genuinely quantum, then we'd better be quantum. The problem is, we have reasons to believe the social world is not. In its structures, in its processes, in its dynamics, is not genuinely quantum, including quantum brains. And quantum brains, and I've read some of this. I know that there's ongoing work. I know things aren't done on this, but the brain shouldn't be quantum because it's not a supercooled environment, right? We don't have Bose-Einstein condensates here. We have the warm brain, and warm brains, warm environments create what? Lots of random movement. And random movement means non-coherence. Finally, quantum models give better predictions. I want to make a distinction here between quantum models that give better predictions because they predict or account for experimental results, as Jacob gave us a little bit of yesterday. He and I had what for me was a fascinating conversation, versus quantum models that give better predictions or explanations of non-experimental data. I worry about the former. I worry about what's happening in some of the quantum decision theory and so on and so forth. Precisely because it's all a better prediction of behavior that is itself generated in experimental settings. So let me give you two reasons that bugs the hell out of me. One, and all the political scientists here have done that. You read a work based on some field experiment, and you say, oh, sure, you could induce that phenomenon in the experimental setting, but it lacks what we call ecological validity. This phenomenon could not be observed outside the experimental setting. Two, I do worry a little bit that we allow the formal properties of the mathematical structures we use to guarantee certain outcomes, right? So what do I understand by that? Well, matrix multiplication is non-commutative, right? So if you work with multiplying matrices, you're going to get certain types of results that you won't get if you don't work with matrix multiplication. I worry a little bit that we're starting with mathematical structures that will give us certain results that we like. I think number 4 is the one we should be working with. This would be my preference. Convince me that quantum brains exist, and man, I will be the biggest pain in the ass cheerleading and endorsing and saying, how do I participate? How do I teach me more? Let me help you, whatever. Until then, I will remain a skeptic. Thank you.
Can I just say one thing, and I won't...
Absolutely.
I just have to say one thing. On number 4, the question is, where is the burden of proof? And you assign the burden of proof to me.
That's
and
right.
I want to turn the burden of proof. You guys have had 300 years to solve this problem of consciousness, and you guys haven't gotten anywhere. So I would say the burden of proof is on you, or at least the burden of proof is equal. But anyway, that was my one comment, and I'm going to shut up now. And just, anybody else wants? We don't have too much time, so go ahead.
Yeah, Badruddin.
Thank you very much, David. It's quite refreshing to read all the caveats and provisos, cautiousness and so on. It's very important to always highlight that. I just want to make more comment on the scale issue that you raised. If the next decade or so we're able to get a quantum gravity,
Yeah.
your whole argument might fail. On this social level. The quantum is not necessarily at this very small scales.
Agreed.
So we have to be
Agreed.
careful with that. So far, we have not been able to come up with quantum particle theory that can make predictions that can be verified in experiments. If we were to do that, and very good, very good progress with that, and a number of people and groups are working on that, then we need to be careful a little bit about the scale. Second, Tony Leggett, who has Nobel Prize in Physics, has been working, and he's got his Nobel Prize in Physics, on macro level type of quantum phenomena. So we have to be careful there a little bit.
Fair enough.
What to make this happen.
I tried to, in no doubt a clumsy way, tried to recognize that. I simply wanted to say, though, that even when we observe quantum effects at a more macro level, they're in carefully controlled environments that probably, and here I'm really just stepping off the cliff, don't exist in the social world.
Chris, I think wants to follow up on this.
So, thanks very much for the talk. I enjoyed it a lot. And I come at a lot of this in some ways from the same sort of perspective as you. I study international relations, but I'm not a grand theorist. I study about public opinion and all that stuff. So, but that then leaves me thinking, I'm wondering why we shouldn't, for me, the reason to do this stuff is, number 5, there's some combination of the 2 bullet points, right? That why shouldn't we start with, say, I'm interested in public opinion, right? Why shouldn't we start with doing some experiments on public opinion to see if we can, and some sort of stuff has already been done in this sort of way about question order effects and things like that. Why shouldn't we start with doing
Right.
some experiments to
Right.
see whether the
Right.
sort of data generation process that we can observe with the way people report their opinions seems to reflect some of these characteristics that aren't well explained
Right.
by kind of possible probability models. And if the answer to that is yes, then we should go out and we should look for some non-experimental data in the real world that is that we think is not well
Yeah.
explained, like variation in public opinion polls, and we should see whether quantum models predict that better. And this is just
Right.
a critical question, right?
Right.
It fits or it doesn't fit.
Right.
That's-
Right. 2 things. One, insofar as that you're agreeing with me that we want to go out into the world a lot more and do real comparative evaluation between classical and quantum models, and I'm not opposed to what you are saying. I really want to distinguish the 2 bullet points here. I mean, let me put it this way. As someone who wants to explain outcomes in the non-experimental world, when I'm told that human beings don't really behave in the way predicted by dictator games or ultimatum games, and therefore we need quantum response game theory, my reaction is to say, so what? Who cares? So insofar as you're able to go and say, we can predict better, or we can account for better than non-quantum models of data out there in the world, then I'm probably going to start agreeing with you pretty quickly, and then maybe that didn't come through clear enough here. But I want to be clear that even if you can find order effects, it doesn't necessarily imply entanglement. Superposition, for example, I understand to be a mathematical phenomenon in some important way. We don't observe superposition. It comes from the linearity of the equations. And so if you say to me, I found order effects that would be predicted by a quantum model, I'm not sure that justifies our thinking about this in terms of superposition breaking down through measurement. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what when I say the fallacy of affirming that. So
One possible explanation.
it's-
There are other possible explanations of that same question.
that's right. And so that we'd have to go one step.
Well, does this theory also help us explain other aspects? And maybe if this one, say, statistical model really helps us explain question order effects and a variety of other aspects of things that are odd, and the alternative to that is to do a grab bag of other just weird stuff that people do, is my other explanation.
I think you loaded that die a little bit, but fair enough.
Okay, we've only got a couple minutes. David has a perspective.
I like this slide here, you know, difference with If you want a nice future, you don't hang around waiting for nice people to materialize, because that's not what happens. In economics, though, that's exactly what happens. Because if you look at sort of wealth distribution in the economy, it doesn't even out the way that it's sort of supposed to. It's sort of actually what there was a report a while ago from Oxfam which said that 10 men, they're all men, had the same amount of wealth as half of the world's population. It's becoming more and more peak. So it's sort of like all the wealth that's sort of concentrated in a bunch. So that particular, so what I would say is that this mirroring has been going on for a very long time. The thing is, we've been mirroring statistical thermodynamics. And, your last point there is about prediction. I would say that is a prediction of this particular approach, which is that wealth should sort of, even out and level, but actually the opposite is happening.
So I'll just say very quickly, in the way that I have presented it to you, it would never occur to me to say that the approach of equilibrium statistical mechanics suggests that wealth will be evenly distributed. I would have said there's a number of macro states, some of which have high levels of inequality and some of which have lower levels of inequality, and we can figure out what parameters select those from micro-level indeterminism. I give an example of that in the paper that maybe that would be helpful for us to talk about a little bit more. I'm not equipped to talk to you specifically about how neoclassical economics dealt with that.
I wouldn't sort of say what you were implying in your paper. This is sort of more of a historical
Right.
example of what's
Right.
actually played out
Right.
in reality, and that's that real world concept.
Right.
So
Gotcha.
I would
Gotcha.
just argue that in that way, quantum thermodynamics offers sort of a different approach, which sort of says that things like entanglement matter and that these things can work in more complicated ways under certain circumstances.
Sure. My only response to that is give me the substance of entanglement. Tell me that entanglement is something different from shared, collective, intersubjective, etc. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the entanglement of two particles requires things like conservation laws. We can, from knowledge of one particle, we can know something about the other particle in terms of its position because we have something called the conservation of momentum. I believe there's a similar conservation law for angular spin. I don't think we have those sorts of laws, and so therefore to talk about entanglement among historically and socially constituted human agents strikes me as too metaphorical and perhaps misleading. That's my response to that.
We'll leave it at that.
Leave it at that. Excellent.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Colin White is the president of University, a colleague of James's, and he's been wrestling with this quantum stuff for several years now, and mostly with you. Yeah, mostly with me, but he's been to all four of the Q symposia, I assume. Essential. So,
And
your view has evolved, is my sense, but well, we'll see. If you're
no,
Oh, is that what's going on?
no, that's not going to happen, James. So, just give you some background. I mean, Alex and I approached this problem from a similar, what I'm going to say is a metaphysical position. So we're both influenced by what's known as critical or scientific realism. We maybe interpret that in different ways, but that's the general background I approach it, and Alex is fairly committed still, I think, to that in the quantum book. I was actually one of the reviewers on the book, and although I say I disagree with it and I'm skeptical, I'm very much in favor of going with the argument to see where it goes. So, and the reason for that is there are multiple ways to get to your endpoint. So even though I have my own reservations, I certainly accept that I could be wrong about this. And so I think the argument should be explored, which is why I still have an active engagement in it. Now, I'm going to do kind of three things today, which wasn't exactly what I planned to do, but I am going to go through my criticisms very quickly, the main points of disagreement. I'm then going to say something about how I think this would play out in social science. So what would a quantum social science look like? And I think, for me, I've got three ideas of what it would look like. One I think that nobody would want. One that doesn't really one that we need to be careful about because we've been there before, and the third one that doesn't make an awful lot of difference. And to kind of prove that point, I want to go through what's the agent structure problem now. I know Jerry doesn't think that problem applies, but I will argue that it does. And I want to compare Alex's view of agency and structure to mine. And I want to say that they actually end up very much the same. And that even though Alex wants to talk about a flat ontology, we're just describing the same world in different ways. And now, I'm generally not somebody who likes a fallback argument where somebody says, oh, it's just a semantic difference. I generally don't like those. But I think I read the agency structure chapters again, but very recently, and I think there's really not much that you could put between us. And I got there without the quantum, so I'm not sure what work the quantum's doing. Okay, so some issues that I have with the kind of the move to put quantum into social science. One is interpretation. There are multiple interpretations of quantum mechanics. So which one do you use, and what are the implications of choosing a different interpretation? Second, the science issue. Now, Alex tackles this head on in the book, but one issue that has always been the social sciences, at least insofar as they aspire to be science, have often been accused of science envy. So they're trying to model themselves on certain visions of science. We've done this. We did it with Newton. We've done it with Darwin, and we seem to be doing it with quantum now. Now, that's not really my problem. My problem is that there's no one thing that is science. There are just different sciences. So I would differentiate physics from chemistry, from biology. And my view is that social sciences should construct their model of science based on the object that they need to study. We don't need to look to the natural sciences for validation. So in a sense, I think we need to be bolder. But this also links, I was kind of taken by one of Mark's comments earlier. So this links to whether a quantum social science would take us back to scientific realism. Well, it depends what you mean by scientific realism there. But if you go with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, you're probably going to end up with logical positivism, less than you're going to end up with scientific realism. So that those two issues really do go together. Another concern I have is that quantum social science could just look like another form of reductionism. And this is a reductionism that's going both ways if we buy some of the models, both from the top down and from the bottom up. The one big issue that Alex and I have really wrestled with, and having read the book again, I'm still not sure what Alex's position is on this, is emergence. So if you accept the idea of emergent properties, then the idea of what I would call levels or different modes of being are really important. Now, Alex wants a flat ontology, but he doesn't want to dismiss the idea of scale. So I wonder whether when you're talking about scale, I'm using levels, and that's something that we could discuss. So I would talk about the domestic politics, regional politics, or international politics. I would talk about those as levels. You talk about them as matters of scale. So I think that's something we could talk about. But related to that, and Alex again goes into some depth in the book on this, is supervenience. So Alex buys supervenience of a certain kind, and I reject it in terms of the agent structure model, which I'll talk about. Now, I reject it because supervenience, as I understand it, basically means if there's a change in property A, there must be a change in property B. So the two are linked. You could call that entanglement again, but I want to come back to that. The other issue, which I've spoken about with lots of people, it's come up today, is whether we take a realist version of quantum mechanics or just a metaphorical one. Now, Alex is very brave in the book, I think, because he takes a strong realist approach, but he actually says that, you could go so far with the metaphorical one. You don't have to buy the realist argument. So, in a sense, the beauty of the book is it is a wager. It's a bet on trying to do something different. Now, the other big problem I have here is the CCP. And here's the issue with this, Alex. I kind of agree with you, but I also interpret it slightly different. For me, it's not that social sciences have to always be consistent with modern-day physics, is that they can't ever propose something that would be inconsistent with it, that goes against it, yeah? And the other thing I have with the CCP is the relationship between quantum mechanics and classical mechanics. Now, It's often thought, and we treat it this way, that quantum mechanics comes along and completely ruins the world of classical mechanics or subverts it. That's not strictly true. We still live in a world of classical mechanics. Thankfully, you know, planes fly, and I rely on those kind of principles. We all do. So it seems to me if you're going to make a social science consistent with a CCP, you've got to try and make it consistent with both classical mechanics and quantum mechanics, and as yet we don't know how to combine them. So for me there's a tension there. Now the one we're really going to disagree on is consciousness. So I have two issues here. One, I don't think the hard problem is a problem, not a scientific problem. It's a philosophical problem. So I don't need to know. The classic line on this is, what would it be like to be a bat? I don't need to know what a bat is like. I'm not interested what it feels for a bat to experience. And I think the social sciences can get on just assuming the fact of consciousness, and I'm with Alex on all of that with intentions, without getting into the problem of consciousness. It may be that our epistemological faculties will never ever solve that problem. I don't know, but I think we can do social science without that. And then the other issue is, and this is where I think Alex will probably admit this, he admits it a few times in the book, so my form of materialism is already very close to where Alex wants to be with quantum materialism. So the fact is, materialism has developed since Newton. So if you're a scientific realist, for example, and you get into what's called causal powers realism, you already accept that matter has power and is alive. So you don't deal with matter as an inert substance. That's part and parcel of the scientific realism that I embrace. So those are the kind of critiques I have. So what kind of options would we get from a social science here? So I'll give you the first one first, that I think nobody's going to want. I'm going to call it quantum formalism. That is that you basically, quantum mechanics really is the most empirically kind of tested theory I think we've had, and it's never been shown to be wrong. So we know how the principles work, so we could explain the social world with that quantum formalism, with the maths. Now the other problem with that is, if you combine it with quantum decision theory, Alex says you can predict human behavior. So what role there is there for social science? If we can describe everything that goes on by using quantum formalism, we've got quantum decision theory to predict, what would a social science do? I should just add though, I mean James and Jairus were there, but I asked Peter Bruiser if he thought his model predicted, and he said no. He thinks his model explains, and he hopes it will go on to predict, but he doesn't think that it does predict at this point in time. Okay, so the other thing, the second model is conceptual stretching. We use, I think this is Jairus' term, we use quantum mechanics to stretch out concepts. The issue, I think, which is the same point that David raised earlier, we have to be very careful about how we use the term. So people are using the term entanglement in a way that I think just means connected or related. And it has if you're going to talk about quantum entanglement, it has particular properties. And we need, by all means use it, but we have to be very careful that we actually use it in a way that is genuinely quantum, not just that we say we're using quantum concepts and then not using them. Okay, so the final way I think we use quantum is that it doesn't make a great deal of difference. So we can have a quantum social science, but it changes very little. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to talk about the agent structure problem, and maybe talk about the state, because I wanted to take the discussion back to international relations. I think that's the core of where Alex certainly wants. Well, no, actually, you wanted to be in social science generally, don't you? But yeah, that's where he comes in.
IR's okay.
IR's okay, and that's where, I think to a lot of people here it would make sense. Okay, so to disagree with Jairus here, my view of the agent structure problem is that it's an attempt to give some ontology to what we mean by society. So when Jairus says everything is a society, I'm still left with the question, well, what is a society? And is it just one thing or many? Does it have differentiated elements? Now, the way I treat agency is a very specific way. I'm not aware, Margaret Archer does this, and I should say I've been working with an interdisciplinary group of people of the Centre for Social Ontology on this and other things. See, I treat agency in 3 levels, and you could call these entangled if you want. So there is the level of the self for me. That's the individual that has the intentions that I think Alex is keen to keep. But that's not what constitutes the social person. That's the self. The social person is different. And if you think about it, we're all born into particularly social, cultural situations. And those social, cultural situations define us as people of a certain kind, male, female, person of colour. They define us. They situate us. But so you've got the self who has intentions. You've got the situated person. But you also have what I call a role. I don't like the concept of a role. I prefer precision practices. But a role is what you occupy. So I'm currently chair of the department at the University of Sydney. And that gives me certain powers to do things that other members of the department don't have, as do the cultural system that placed me already. Now, what you get from that is the person, in my view of the world, is already, and I'll use the word entangled, because I prefer positioned, is entangled with social structures that define them. There's no way of separating those structures from me. The self can never exist. No man is an island, if you want to use John Donne. So what about social structure then? So how does this relate to social structure? Well, I'm already part of a social structure. Now, Alex goes into the end of the book and has a look at what we call the levels of analysis problem. Just for people that aren't IR, I'll maybe try and do IR 101 on the level of analysis problem. So imagine you're trying to explain war. You could look at, is war caused by human nature is one classic argument, that human nature is the cause of war. Another could be that it's the type of state, that authoritarian states are more prone to go to war, or you could say democratic states are more peace-loving. And the third level is what we call the system. And this is an argument that comes from David Singer and then Kenneth Waltz. Now, the typical way we've dealt with levels in international relations, when you look at the agent structure problem, is we've actually had the individual maybe located in the state or with a bureaucracy at one level. And the agent there is the individual. When you go up to the state level and the system, the agent becomes the state. So all of the properties of individuals are given to the state. And that's the way we talk about the state generally in international relations. We talk about the state being a person, and Alex and I both took part in a forum to discuss this issue. So I don't think of levels that way. Alex accepts the idea of scale, so let's talk about the international level. I see the international level, the agent is still the individual. It's still a human individual embedded within a set of structures that construct them as an actor of a certain kind, enmeshed in a load of material and social conditions that shape and enable what they can do. And you can come that down to the regional level, and the individual is still at the regional level. You don't change your agent moving up and down levels. Your agent stays the same. So when Alex is talking about in his book about a flat ontology and that structure kind of flows through, I absolutely agree with that. The structure is not, a social structure is not something above you. It's not a place. It's not hierarchical. Levels are just, for me, do refer to levels of scale, not necessarily different entities. So you as individuals are already completely structured. So I'm just wondering, if I get there, and I think we may disagree, if I can get so close to that without the quantum, I'm just still wondering what exactly it is the quantum does and whether we need it. And just one final comment. It may be that, people run with this and it works, and I'd be really pleased for you, but it also has some potential negativities as well that could flow out of it, particularly if you think about the whole science envy thing. So, which goes back to Mark's thing, I think. It's not, I'll just end on a Foucauldian thing. It's not that everything is evil, it's everything is potentially dangerous. And you have to think about those dangers in terms of the ethics and the politics of the kind of social science that we produce. So, thank you.
We can take about 10 minutes, and then we're going to take a short break, and then give Steve sort of the final sort of set of comments. So, questions, comments, Colin?
So structure all the way up and all the way down, right? So the individual acting in concert is an agent structure problem. One of the ways we know that is like even Kant, one of like the most unified structure ever, could figure out how the senses accord provide a continuous experience of phenomena. That to me isn't any different than the how do states act in unity despite its inner working parts, right? Government values, things like that. Here's my question though. When you move up levels, do you get ontologically distinct properties? Meaning, can they do things that are not some of their parts? And if they can, how are those emergent qualities created?
Well, the answer is yes, and it's going to sound tautological. How the properties are created is through the process of emergence.
But emergence from the parts, or because it's a new whole?
Both,
So that's
but
a distinction.
well, both actually. So I have to be careful here. And Alex does a really good job of this. So downwards causation as well. I mean, you never really know. Talking about levels, this is a really, when you talk about levels, it's easy to think of things sitting on top of each other. That's not really what I mean. But you definitely get once a scale or level has emerged, it has the ability. One of the things about emergence is it insists on downwards causation. So emergence isn't really emergence unless you get downwards causation. The other way I've come to describe it is in terms of assemblages. So at different levels you get a conjunction of all different elements. But I would definitely want a more differentiated ontology than maybe you would like. So I want to see different entities with different properties.
So could you have novelty, or is it?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, that's exactly what emergence does. Absolutely. You can't. Emergence makes no sense without novelty, because then you just talk about things without demonstrating why they've emerged and what's unique about them.
Colin, I know how much you love metaphors, but what you've just...
I'm with Jarius. Metaphors are real, so.
Right. Icebergs can take down ships. So I'm just curious, it sounds like you're describing phase shifts when you talk about levels. And what phase shifts in quantum are about is the loss or gain of energy and power, which also sounds like you described. So, in one hand, if you turn, if you want to use this as a, not you, but somebody else, a metaphor, it sounds very quantum.
Yeah, but my point is I can get there without the quantum. So you see.
Well, that's less
Yeah,
clear, but
yeah.
okay.
Well, but you want to redescribe what I'm saying in quantum terms. That's absolutely fine. I can't dictate how you understand what I'm saying, but I don't think I need the quantum to get there. The book's 10 years old now.
Well, explain to us then how power works in your phase shifts.
Power,
Yeah.
generally embedded within social structures for me. But the individual still has some power. So, well, a lot of you know Steve Smith. Steve Smith has a set of properties that are unique to Steve that I don't have. So Steve has, when Steve's presenting, Steve Smith used to be my PhD supervisor, he uses humor in a way that I can't. And that's a property of Steve, unique to him. And some people can do that. But power's everywhere. I'm a Foucauldian on power. But, I'm a Foucauldian, but I still like power from the top as well. So I don't want to cut off the head of the state.
Fair.
So, by way of background, I should say that quantitative model that we're all socialized into essentially being clean. So, I'm sort of beavering away at the next little increment of knowledge that can come out of the data. But so partly for that reason, I'm kind of a little puzzled. The
I'm not sure I understand the question. Partly because I don't really buy Kuhn's account of science. I mean, you assume that you're modelling in normal science, and I think what Alex is trying to do is revolutionary science. Yeah. So that's in Kuhn's terms, but it may not be appropriate to talk in Kuhn's terms. I mean, I would just say that I have to be careful here. So I generally am against the idea that we can predict social outcomes, and that's because we're trying to model or explain in open systems that always have multiple mechanisms in play. So you might identify a mechanism or a correlation, but that doesn't mean it's going to be what we call a constant conjunction. So I'm absolutely, although having said that, I can predict that, that most of us are going to go to dinner tonight. A level of, it's not necessarily prediction, but expectation about human behavior is necessary in order for social life to go on. So it's one of the strange paradoxes, I think. So.
I'm sorry if you explained this, I didn't get it. I'm pretty tired at this moment.
Probably.
Today. But Alex's book is also about consciousness, right? and maybe I didn't quite listen to that properly, but I think that you kind of brought up consciousness, and then decided to not talk about it, or describe it as a potentially emergent phenomenon. But for me, I guess, that's one of the foundational concepts of this book, is this idea of consciousness within the idea of a quantum series of quantum effects as something that goes beyond just sort of like describing subjectivity as something that happens, but the difference between being dead or alive, for example. So could you just maybe speak a bit on consciousness and whether you see it as sort of like a bunch of causations? Did you just say something about emergences, kind of backwards causation?
Yeah.
So then if that doesn't work, according to quantum effects, causation, mechanical causation breaks down at a certain point, then how would you explain consciousness without making that quantum like
I wouldn't.
What's your solution to the mind-body problem?
Okay.
That's kind of what I meant.
Okay. No. Consciousness is an emergent property of the firing of neurons, to me.
Well, that's what people have been saying for a century or two,
Yeah.
and there's no evidence of that at all.
But that's only if you buy the hard problem.
Okay.
David Chalmers sets up this distinction between a hard and the easy problem with consciousness, and he says science is solving the easy problem, not the hard problem. I don't accept that the hard problem is a genuine scientific problem. It's what Wittgenstein would call a mistake in terms of language. So that's why I don't. So I don't think that's a genuine problem.
But I just feel like that's not, sorry, it doesn't quite seem like enough of a response to just say it's not the problem.
Okay, well let me.
I guess I just,
No,
tell me more about
no,
how
well,
there's no life.
no, well, let me-
It's a problem for me, and I feel like for Alex, it's like the problem of the book, so.
Well, let me
That's
explain.
just wrong.
Now, let me explain what the hard problem is as I understand it, yeah? So, the hard problem is, we can explain how we have experiences through the firing of neurons, but we can't explain what it's like to be me to experience the colour red. Yeah? And I just think, I don't care. Why would you want to know how I experience the colour red in a scientific context?
Well, why wouldn't you?
Well,
Why wouldn't you, actually? You want to know everything.
Yeah.
What empirical difference would it make? Because if in fact, what the materialists are now telling us is that consciousness is an illusion, that's what your framework is. The leading materialists are now saying this is an illusion. And if that's the end point of this research program, that strikes me as a bankrupt.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. And
So if it's not an illusion, then we got to figure out how to explain it.
Yeah.
Right. We can't just take it for granted because the materials are saying, no, you can't take it for granted. It's an illusion. We can't explain it.
You can't explain why I experience red the way I do. Or
You can't explain why you experience red at all. You can't explain why you experience.
I know
That's the issue.
Well, no, that's the easy problem for me.
No, that's the hard problem.
No, the hard problem is no. The hard problem is for the author. Basically, is what's it like to be a bat? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not what it's like to be Colin.
No.
It's what it's like to be any.
Yeah, exactly.
Experiencing
To have
something.
experience. Yeah, but
Any kind of.
and I think the easy problem tells you that. How I get to experience something is through emergence, through
I
the
just
of
think
neurons.
That's a hand-waving miracle.
But you say that, Alex. But I think the quantum one doesn't help explain the
No,
hard
I know.
problem. Doesn't help
Well,
explain the hard problem.
panpsychism is the solution. I think.
Yeah.
Not quantum, so.
Yeah. But, I mean, panpsychism, so in the book, yeah, we could argue for hours on this. Panpsychism in the book, I mean, so you actually, how can I put this? So you don't actually mean, when you're talking about panpsychism in the natural world, as far as I understood it, consciousness as we're talking about it in terms of intentionality.
No, I do.
Do you?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I thought
I
you-
don't think rocks have intentionality, but I do think it goes all the way down, yeah. But we should probably stop, we're over 4:30 now, we gotta take a little break, and then we'll have one last round, and then get some dinner. Okay?
Cheers.